The gymnasium lights dimmed. My name got called for the raffle. Grab a partner, the host said. Any partner. A stranger's hand found mine in the dark. Her fingers were warm. Mine were shaking. We spun once. The room disappeared around us. She whispered. I know you. My heart stopped. 6 months later. Everything I built collapsed in one night. This is the story of the night I stopped hiding. My name is Maya Reyes. I teach choir at a public high school in Eugene, Oregon. And until that October night, I believed I understood exactly who I was. I was wrong. And the woman who proved it to me would become the reason I finally stopped apologizing for my own heart. The fundraiser was for the Community Arts Center, the kind of event where teachers wore borrowed blazers and pretended not to check price tags on the silent auction. I only came because my friend Denise begged me to fill an empty table seat, promising free wine and an early exit if I hated it. The partner raffle was Denise's idea of fun. She loved forcing shy people into ballroom lessons taught by a retired dance instructor named Mr. Alvarez. When they called my ticket number, I groaned and walked toward the dance floor, already planning my apology to whichever stranger got stuck with me. That stranger turned out to be a woman in a green dress, her dark hair pinned up, introducing herself simply as Sophie. No last name offered. Mr. Alvarez counted the beat, and Sophie moved like she'd been dancing her whole life, patient with my clumsy feet and awkward posture. Relax your shoulders, she said, laughing softly. I promise I won't tell anyone you stepped on my foot twice already. Something about her voice made the noisy gymnasium fade into background static. Like the only sound left was our breathing and the slow violin. When the song ended, neither of us stepped back right away. And Denise later swore she saw sparks from clear across the room. Sophie mentioned she taught art at the elementary school down the street. And I found myself hoping the conversation wouldn't end there. We talked until the caterers started stacking chairs. About students. About Oregon rain. About nothing important. And somehow about everything at once. Before she left, she wrote her number on an auction program page and said, "Text me if you ever want a rematch. Miss Reyes." I watched her walk to a car where a man was waiting in the driver's seat, and my stomach dropped before I understood why. I didn't text her for 3 days, telling myself it was inappropriate to chase a woman who clearly had a boyfriend waiting outside. Denise finally confessed the raffle wasn't random at all. She'd rigged the numbers because Sophie's cousin, a mutual friend, thought we'd get along. That confession changed nothing about the man in the car, but it made me wonder if the universe was trying to tell me something anyway. Sophie texted first, asking if I wanted to grab coffee near the school where we both worked, framing it as professional networking. We met at a small shop called Fernwood, and within 10 minutes the professional pretense dissolved into 2 hours of easy, overlapping laughter. She told me about Brian, her fiancé of 8 months, a good man from a good family who worked in real estate and never raised his voice. I told her about my last relationship, a woman named Kate who left 2 years earlier because I was too afraid to introduce her to my mother. Sophie's eyes softened at that, and she said quietly, "I understand being afraid of what people think more than you'd guess." We started meeting every week, always with an excuse, grading papers together, planning a joint music and art showcase, borrowing supplies from each other's classrooms. My students started asking why I hummed while taking attendance, and I didn't have an honest answer I was ready to give them. Sophie began saving me a seat at staff meetings, small gestures that meant nothing to anyone else but felt enormous to me. One rainy afternoon, stuck under the same umbrella, she admitted Brian had proposed faster than she expected, and she'd said yes out of relief, not certainty. Relief that what? Asked, and she looked away, watching raindrops slide off leaves instead of answering me directly. I told myself I was imagining the tension between us, that it was ordinary friendship, that lonely women just made these things up. But then she started texting me good morning before she texted Brian good morning, and I noticed. And I let myself notice. We spent a Saturday building a mural for the district art fair. Paint on our hands, shoulders brushing as we reached for the same brush. "You have paint on your cheek," she said, reaching up before catching herself, hand hovering awkwardly in the air between us. I didn't move away. Neither did she. The moment stretched until a janitor walked in and we both stepped back too quickly. That night I called Denise and admitted, for the first time out loud, that I thought I was falling for an engaged woman. Denise didn't judge me, she just asked if Sophie felt it too. And I honestly didn't know how to answer that question. The next week Sophie canceled our coffee plans twice, and I convinced myself she'd finally realized how dangerous our friendship had become. When she finally showed up, her eyes were red, and she said Brian's mother had started planning the wedding without asking her opinion on anything. "It's like I'm a guest at my own life," she whispered. And I reached across the table before I could stop myself. I held her hand for exactly 4 seconds before she pulled back, glancing around the coffee shop like someone might be watching. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. But she shook her head and said, "Don't be." That's the first time I felt steady in weeks. We didn't talk about what that meant, but something shifted between us. An unspoken agreement to stop pretending this was simple. I started dreaming about her. Ordinary dreams. Grocery shopping and folding laundry. The kind of dreams that scared me more than anything dramatic could. At the winter showcase, our students performed together. Her paintings displayed beside my choir songs, and she stood close enough that our arms touched. Backstage after the show, surrounded by proud parents, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "You make me want things I'm not supposed to want." I didn't sleep that night, replaying her words, terrified of what they meant and even more terrified of what I wanted them to mean. Christmas break separated us for 2 weeks, and every day without her felt longer than the 10 years since I'd last felt this way. She texted on New Year's Eve, just past midnight, "Thinking about you instead of counting down. Is that terrible?" I stared at my phone for 10 minutes before typing back, "No." I did the same thing, and hitting send before I lost my nerve. When school resumed, she found an excuse to walk me to my car every single afternoon, rain or not, saying she just needed the air. One evening she stayed late helping me organize sheet music, and when our hands both reached the same folder, she didn't pull away this time. "Sophie," I started, unsure what I was even going to say, but she looked up and said, "Please don't finish that sentence yet. I need to figure some things out first," she said, "before I let myself hear whatever you're about to tell me." I nodded, swallowing the words I'd been holding for months, and we sat in silence until the janitor turned off the hallway lights. For the first time, I let myself imagine an actual future with her. Not just stolen glances but mornings, a shared kitchen, an ordinary life. I also let myself imagine losing her entirely, and that fear kept me from pushing harder no matter how much I wanted to. Sophie started attending my Sunday choir rehearsals at the community church, sitting in the back pew, humming along even though she claimed she couldn't sing. "I just like being near the sound," she admitted once, and I decided that was the most honest thing anyone had ever told me. Her engagement ring started feeling like an elephant between us, something neither of us mentioned but both of us watched out of the corner of our eyes. One night, walking her to her car, I finally asked, "Do you love him?" "Sophie, actually love him, not just comfortable with him." She didn't answer right away, staring at the ring like she was seeing it for the first time in months. "I don't know anymore," she finally said. "And that terrifies me more than anything you could possibly say to me right now." I told her I wasn't trying to break anything apart, that I just needed her to be honest with herself, whatever that honesty revealed. "What if I'm honest?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "And it's you? What if it's always been you since that dance?" I couldn't breathe. I just reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her face, letting my hand linger against her cheek. She leaned into my palm, closing her eyes, And for one suspended second the entire world outside that parking lot ceased to exist. Then her phone buzzed with Brian's name on the screen, and she stepped back so fast she nearly tripped over the curb. "I have to go," she said, and drove away without looking back, leaving me standing alone under a flickering streetlight, heart cracked wide open. For 2 weeks Sophie avoided me entirely, replying to texts with one-word answers, disappearing during lunch instead of eating with me like usual. I told myself to respect her space, but every hallway I walked down felt hollow without the chance of running into her. Denise warned me this could end badly, that loving someone who wasn't ready to choose herself would only leave me collecting the pieces. I didn't listen, because some stubborn part of me still believed Sophie would eventually choose the truth over comfort. Word started spreading around the district anyway. Whispers from a parent volunteer who'd seen us holding hands in that parking lot. My principal called me into her office, not to reprimand me exactly, but to check in about appropriate boundaries, which we both understood meant something else. I left that meeting shaking, terrified my job, the only stability I'd built after Kate left, might unravel over something I hadn't even claimed yet. Sophie heard the rumors too, and instead of running toward me, she panicked and set a wedding date with Brian for that June. She told me in the school parking lot, refusing to meet my eyes, saying it was the responsible thing for everyone involved. Responsible for who? Asked, and she finally admitted, for my parents. They can't know about this. They can't ever know about you. Sophie's father was a deacon at their church, a man who once told her a cousin's coming out was a phase that embarrassed the whole family. I understood fear like that intimately. My own mother hadn't spoken to me for 8 months after I brought Kate home for Thanksgiving years earlier. So we just stop? Asked, my voice cracking despite every effort to keep it steady in that empty parking lot. I don't know what else to do, Sophie said, tears sliding down her face even as she insisted this was the only option left. I walked away that day without saying goodbye, because I knew if I looked at her one more second I would beg her to stay. For a month, I threw myself into work. Extra rehearsals, extra grading, anything to avoid the silence that used to be filled with her voice. My sister Anna noticed something was wrong, and pushed until I finally told her everything. The dance, the coffee shop, the almost kiss under the streetlight. Anna, unlike our mother, hugged me tightly and said she'd suspected for months, watching how differently I talked about my friend Sophie. But Anna also worried aloud about me getting hurt again, remembering how long it took me to recover after Kate walked away. Promise me you'll protect yourself this time, she said. And I promised, though I already suspected it was a promise I couldn't keep. In March, the elementary school announced a joint spring concert with the high school choir, forcing Sophie and me into the same rehearsal space again. We were professional, painfully so, discussing lighting cues and program order like two colleagues who'd never memorized the shape of each other's laughter. One evening after rehearsal, Sophie lingered by the door and quietly asked if I still thought about that night at the fundraiser. Every single day, I admitted, unable to keep pretending indifference I clearly didn't feel. Not with her standing 3 feet away. Me too, she whispered. And I hate that I'm too much of a coward to do anything about it. I told her she wasn't a coward, that fear made sense, that I understood better than almost anyone what her family's rejection could cost her. But I can't keep being your secret, I added, even if I love being near you more than I love almost anything else. She flinched at the word love, not because she doubted it, she admitted later, but because hearing it out loud made everything unbearably real. Brian noticed her distraction too, and one night he asked outright if there was someone else. If that explained her constant distance lately. Sophie later told me she almost confessed everything right there. But her father walked in mid-conversation, and the moment closed like a door. Her father's presence loomed over every decision she made. A shadow neither Brian nor I could compete with no matter how hard we tried. I started attending therapy again, something I'd stopped after Kate left, because loving Sophie was reopening wounds I thought had already healed completely. My therapist, Dear Okafor, asked a question that stuck with me. Are you waiting for her? Or are you disappearing to make room for her fear? I didn't have an answer. But the question haunted every interaction, every rehearsal, every accidental brush of hands passing sheet music between us. In April, Sophie's mother started calling her every day about wedding invitations, seating charts, flower arrangements, drowning her in decisions that felt like someone else's life. She confided in me during a rare quiet moment that she'd started having panic attacks in the church parking lot before family dinners. I offered to drive her to a doctor, but she refused, terrified that any deviation from the plan would trigger more questions she couldn't answer. One Sunday, Sophie showed up unannounced at my apartment, mascara smudged, saying she couldn't breathe inside her own engagement anymore. I let her in, matey, and sat beside her on the couch while she cried into a mug she never actually drank from. I don't want the wedding, she finally said, but I don't know how to tell them without losing everyone I've ever known. I held her while she shook, careful not to say anything that would push her faster than she was ready to move. Around midnight, she fell asleep on my shoulder, and I stayed perfectly still for 2 hours, memorizing the weight of her against me. When she woke, panic replaced the calm from the night before, and she left before sunrise, apologizing repeatedly for putting me in that position. I told her she never had to apologize for needing somewhere safe, but she was already halfway out the door, keys jingling nervously in her hand. 2 days later, a parent complaint reached the school board, someone claiming they'd seen inappropriate behavior between 2 female teachers from different schools. The investigation was brief and found nothing actionable, but the damage was done. My name was now attached to rumors I couldn't control. Sophie panicked entirely after that, distancing herself so completely that even our professional interactions turned cold and clipped, like strangers forced into proximity. I understood the fear driving her, but understanding didn't stop the ache of watching someone I loved erase me to protect herself. By May, wedding planning consumed her fully. Save the dates mailed, a dress purchased, a venue booked overlooking a lake her family had visited for generations. I told myself I needed to let her go, that loving someone shouldn't require watching them disappear into a life that wasn't truly theirs. I stopped texting first, stopped lingering after meetings, stopped hoping every time my phone buzzed that it might finally be her name. Then, 3 weeks before the wedding, Sophie's father collapsed at church during a Sunday service, and everything I thought I understood shifted entirely. Sophie called me in tears, saying her father had a heart attack and was in the ICU, and she didn't know who else to call first. I drove to the hospital without hesitation, sitting with her in the waiting room for 6 hours while doctors ran tests down the hall. Brian arrived too, holding her hand on one side while I sat quietly on the other, an arrangement none of us acknowledged out loud. When her father finally woke, weak but stable, he asked to speak with Sophie alone, and I stepped into the hallway to wait. She emerged 20 minutes later, pale and stunned, saying her father had apologized for how he'd treated her cousin years earlier. He said watching me plan a wedding I don't want reminded him of every regret he's carried since, she told me, voice shaking. Her father, facing his own mortality, admitted he'd suspected for months that she wasn't marrying Brian out of love, and he'd stayed silent out of pride. I don't want you to have my regrets, he told her, gripping her hand from the hospital bed. Whoever it is, I want you happy. Sophie broke down completely in that hospital hallway, and this time I held her without caring who from the district might see us. That single conversation with her father cracked open something Sophie had kept sealed for months, a permission she never expected to receive. But permission from one parent didn't erase the fear of her mother, who still believed the wedding represented the family's greatest achievement that year. 2 nights later, Sophie called off the engagement, telling Brian directly and honestly that she couldn't marry someone while loving somebody else. Brian To his credit, didn't yell. He simply asked one question. Is it her? The music teacher. And Sophie finally said yes. Word spread through their small church community within days. Exactly the public unraveling Sophie had feared for the entire 8 months I'd known her. Her mother refused to speak to her, echoing the silence my own mother once gave me. A painful symmetry neither of us had wanted. I offered to stay away from school events until things calmed down. Worried my presence made everything harder on Sophie during an already brutal time. She refused. Showing up to my choir concert that Friday and sitting in the front row where everyone could see exactly where she'd chosen to sit. After the concert, walking to our cars, she finally said the words I'd been waiting 9 months to hear. I love you, Maya. I kissed her then. In that same parking lot where she'd once driven away from me. And this time neither of us pulled back. For a few weeks, it felt like everything might finally be simple. 2 women choosing each other despite the noise surrounding that choice. Then a local news blog picked up the canceled wedding story, framing it as scandal, naming both schools, publishing details someone close to us must have leaked. I suspected a coworker at first, but the truth cut deeper. My own sister Anna had mentioned it, unknowingly, to a friend who worked in local media. Anna was devastated when she realized her mistake, insisting she never meant harm. Only excitement that I'd finally found someone who made me happy. I forgave her almost immediately, understanding that carelessness born from love wasn't the same as betrayal born from cruelty. But the damage still spread. The district superintendent called an emergency meeting, citing community concerns, and for the first time I genuinely feared losing the career I'd built. Sophie insisted on attending the meeting with me, refusing to let me face it alone even though her presence risked her own position too. Parents packed the room, some supportive, holding signs from a local equality organization, others hostile, demanding protection of traditional values in their children's classrooms. I stood and spoke for the first time publicly about who I was, my voice shaking but steady, refusing to apologize for loving someone honestly. Sophie stood beside me, holding my hand in front of everyone, and said, "If loving her costs me my community, then it was never truly mine." The meeting ended without resolution, but something shifted in the room. A handful of parents approaching afterward to offer quiet, unexpected support. That night, exhausted and raw, Sophie and I sat on my apartment floor, unsure if we just won something or lost everything simultaneously. 2 days later, the district announced no disciplinary action would be taken, citing no policy violations, only public discomfort that wasn't grounds for punishment. Felt like a hollow victory, relief tangled with exhaustion, knowing the whispers in hallways wouldn't disappear just because the official verdict had. Sophie's mother, hearing about the public meeting, finally called her daughter, not to apologize, but to say she needed time to process everything. It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't the door slamming shut either. And Sophie clung to that small crack of possibility with everything she had. Brian, surprisingly, became one of our unexpected allies, telling mutual friends that Sophie deserved happiness even if it hadn't come from him. His grace made the transition slightly gentler, though Sophie still carried guilt for the pain she'd caused a genuinely kind man along the way. We moved in together that August, a small apartment near the river, filling it with mismatched furniture and the paintings Sophie had made throughout the ordeal. For the first time in either of our lives, we stopped hiding at grocery stores, at restaurants, at the simple act of holding hands walking down the street. But peace didn't last uninterrupted. Sophie's father's health declined again in September. Another scare that reminded us how fragile everything truly was. This time, I sat beside her in the hospital as family, not as a secret. Introduced by Sophie herself as the woman I love. Her father squeezed my hand weakly and said, "Take care of her better than I ever protected her." Words that undid me completely. He passed away 3 weeks later, And Sophie's grief was enormous, made heavier by regret that reconciliation had come only in his final months. I held her through nights of sobbing, through a funeral where her mother barely acknowledged my presence, through the slow work of learning to grieve. At the funeral reception, Sophie's mother approached me directly for the first time, saying only, "He talked about you." He wanted this for her. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it was an opening. The first sign that time and grief might eventually soften what pride had hardened. Winter brought quiet healing. Sophie returning to her art with renewed intensity, painting a series inspired by that fundraiser gymnasium and the dance that started everything. I watched her rebuild herself piece by piece, no longer performing a version of her life designed for someone else's approval. One evening, hanging her paintings for a small gallery show, she stopped in front of the largest canvas, two women dancing under dim gymnasium lights. "This one's called The Night I Stopped Hiding," she said, echoing words I'd once written in a text message to her months earlier. The gallery show sold out within its opening weekend, and a reviewer called it an unflinching portrait of love found through loss and courage. Standing in that gallery, watching strangers move past paintings of our life together, I finally understood we'd survived the hardest part. That spring, Sophie received an invitation to a prestigious 6-month artist fellowship in Chicago, an opportunity she once believed impossible for someone like her. She almost declined immediately, afraid that leaving would somehow undo everything we'd fought to build together over the past year. I told her she had to go, that loving her meant refusing to become another reason she shrank her own life smaller than it deserved. "What about us?" she asked. And I said, "We figure it out. The same way we figured out everything else that scared us." We spent weeks planning video calls, visits, a long-distance rhythm neither of us had attempted before, terrified but determined not to let fear win again. The night before she left, we sat on our apartment floor surrounded by suitcases, and she asked if I regretted any part of our story. "Not 1 second, I told her. Not the parking lot. Not the hospital. Not even the district meeting that nearly destroyed me." She left for Chicago in June, and the apartment felt impossibly quiet, filled only with the paintings she'd left behind on every wall. We called every night, sometimes just to watch each other cook dinner in separate cities, refusing to let distance erase the intimacy we'd built. In August, my mother called unexpectedly, the first call in nearly 3 years, saying she'd seen an article about the school district controversy online. I braced for judgment, but instead she said quietly, "I should have called when Kate left. I'm calling now. I want to understand." We talked for 2 hours, awkward and imperfect, but it was a door creaking open after years of silence I'd stopped hoping would end. I told her about Sophie, about Chicago, about the fellowship, and for the first time my mother asked genuine questions instead of offering silent disapproval. "I'd like to meet her," she said finally, and I cried on the phone like I hadn't cried since the night Kate packed her last box. Sophie flew back for a long weekend in September, and I introduced her to my mother over an awkward, tentative dinner neither family quite knew how to navigate. It wasn't perfect. My mother stumbled over pronouns and old habits, but she tried. And trying meant more than I'd ever expected to receive. Sophie's mother, meanwhile, sent a birthday card that October, the first communication in over a year. Signed simply, "Thinking of you, Mom." Small gestures accumulated slowly, proof that families could bend without fully breaking. That time occasionally repaired what pride had once shattered. In November, Sophie's fellowship offered her a permanent teaching position in Chicago, forcing the biggest decision of our relationship into sharp, immediate focus. I flew out that weekend, and we sat by Lake Michigan discussing futures, careers, compromises, refusing to let either of us disappear into the other's plans. "I don't want you to give up your choir," she said, and I told her Eugene wasn't the only place in America that needed music teachers. We decided together, I would apply for positions in Chicago that spring, and if nothing worked out, we'd reassess without resentment or blame. In March, a public arts high school in Chicago offered me a choir director position, an opportunity that felt too perfectly timed to be coincidence. I accepted. And for the first time, our future stopped feeling like something we were surviving and started feeling like something we were building. I moved to Chicago that June, exactly 1 year after Sophie had left, our apartment finally reuniting two lives that had learned to bend without breaking. We hosted a small housewarming, inviting Denise, Anna, and to everyone's surprise, both of our mothers, sitting at the same table for the first time. The dinner was awkward in places, silences stretching longer than comfortable, but no one left early, and that felt like its own quiet miracle. Sophie's mother pulled me aside afterward and said, "I still don't fully understand it, but I understand my daughter is happy. That's enough for now." That October, on the 2-year anniversary of the fundraiser dance, Sophie asked me to meet her at a small gallery downtown after work. I walked in to find the room decorated with string lights. Our friends and family gathered quietly among her paintings from that difficult year. Sophie stood beside the painting titled, "The Night I Stopped Hiding," and asked me to marry her. Voice steady despite everyone watching. I said yes before she even finished the question, laughing through tears as our families applauded. The same families who'd once feared this exact moment. My mother hugged Sophie tightly, whispering something I couldn't hear. And Sophie later told me she'd said, "Take care of my daughter's whole heart." Sophie's mother stood a little apart, still learning, still adjusting. But she stayed the entire evening. And she stayed for every evening after that. We planned a small wedding for the following spring. Nothing like the elaborate ceremony Sophie once nearly walked into for all the wrong reasons. Instead, we chose a community arts center, the same kind of building where a rigged raffle ticket had first placed her hand in mine. Mr. Alvarez, the retired dance instructor, agreed to teach us our first dance, laughing that he'd suspected something the very first night we met. Standing in that gymnasium months later, dressed in simple white, I finally understood that love built on courage outlasts love built only on comfort. Denise cried through the entire ceremony, claiming full credit for engineering the greatest love story in Eugene, Oregon history, and honestly, she wasn't entirely wrong. 3 years after that random dance, I stood in a Chicago classroom teaching harmony, wearing a ring from the woman who taught me hands, once truly found, should never let go. I stopped hiding the night Sophie Coleman refused to release my hand, and I have spent every day since choosing her, and myself, in the open. Vandy.